Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Ignored His Friend's War? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. The spring break slowly came to an end and the students of UA High moved back into the dorms, some more excited than others. The ones who wanted to get used to the modern environment again or simply felt like spending the last week of the spring break with their friends, settled calmly into their personal rooms, sorting their clothing and belongings into their wardrobes and drawers and catching up with classmates. Considering both Mei Hatsum and Izuku Midoriya were fixated on developing more and more ideas from their self-made countless blueprints into functional support items, they were under the few who had decided to live the last stress-free week in the dorm buildings of Class 3H, one of the 3 support courses. Geez, where's the diamond screwdriver? Izuku hissed a little muffled under the dark gray gas mask covering his mouth and nose. He got up from his poorly cushioned, old office chair type of seat, dropping the screwdriver with one of the sleeves of his blue-grayish overall he had loosely tied around his waist previously that had been lying on his messy workspace. With his beige over-ear headphones, covered in small oil stains and various, faded stickers of different pro heroes, blasting, "Why'd you only call me when you're high?" by Arctic Monkeys at a concerning volume, he turned to one of his many cabinets. Filled to the brim with tools, supplements, failed projects, and more junk, the drawers stood halfway open. Izuku dug his forearm into one of said overflowing drawers, rummaging a bit through its contents before realizing he wouldn't find what he looked for and only had worsened the chaos in there. He shut the drawer again as much as its screws allowed it before he took off his headphones and turned them off. He freed himself from the gas mask he had been wearing for the past 3 hours and inhaled an unfiltered whiff of smoke. Better than the stuffy gas mask at least, he thought, and crouched down on the floor, holding his balance with his calloused palm gripping the edge of his desk. His eyes grazed blueprints either rolled up or laid out, developed by him and his best friend Mei throughout the now 2 years they were together at the Hero High School. Entering the last year before graduation put the 2 teenagers into a strained state of mind, although school didn't even officially begin yet. Having met right at the beginning of their academic journey at the prestigious school, Mei and Izuku had befriended each other quickly due to their mutual obsession of crafting support items of all kinds and similar mindset, incredibly chaotic and open-minded concerning almost every single aspect. Both had settled rather early on the idea of founding a company providing support machinery for pro heroes as a duo, preferably right after graduation. The 2 workaholics had the necessary qualifications for their field of work, finishing close to every exam at the top of their class. They'd even gathered all the documents and applications that were required. The only thing left open was a decently sized place for their business. Maybe some sort of manager could be useful too, as neither Mei nor Izuku liked having to leave their projects to uncertain interruptions, but that had to wait for when they had earned enough money to actually pay any employees. He let his tired, green gaze wander over a few scattered piles of materials before he heard light footsteps approaching his slumped-down form. The worn-out student felt a strong stare piercing through his back, but instead of asking what his pink-haired friend could possibly want, he continued the miserable search for his beloved screwdriver. A rough ruffle through his hair made him lose his balance, and he plopped down on his butt, his muscular arms hugging his legs wrapped in the wide cargo pants of his overall. A few bolts spilled out of one of the many side pockets, but Izuku couldn't care less. Although the ruffling stopped, Izuku wished it hadn't taken place at all, as his long, dark green curls disturbed his vision. "I keep telling you to at least let me cut your hair, if you hate being away from your desk so much." A cheery voice erupted from above him, making him stifle a sigh. It seemed that with each day, his overgrown bush of hair bothered Mei more than it did him. And although it did in fact annoy him, he liked having the long ringlets framing his face enough to keep them. But he still cussed on the frequent occasion of strands falling into his sight and would only tie himself a ponytail after the girl would yell at him to stop cussing at something that he apparently didn't dislike. Said female only earned a long, exaggerated groan as answer, causing her to glance down at him. A pretty rare thing ever since the green-haired boy basically shot up thanks to an insane growth spurt in between their first and second year, a little less than 40 centimeters from his height back at the beginning of high school. After a few moments of comfortable silence, he felt like he had to give her some sort of reply involving words, so he grunted an exhausted, "You know I like it this way more." He heard May shuffle a bit before she sat down next to him on the messy ground covered with clean epoxy flooring. She gently tilted her head and leaned down on his large shoulder, exposed since he wore his favorite black tank top that matched with May's. "Looking for the screwdriver again?" She took his delay of words as a yes and reached out her hand. Right in front of his red high-top sneakers laid that goddamn thing, probably laughing at him in whatever other Wicked Universe tools had the ability to do so. Throwing the item lazily on his table, she put her arm back to her side and played with a strand of his hair with another hand. "Is Shoto back already?" Izuku shrugged. "I'll text him later anyway." He requested a part for his costume, something about regulating the temperatures to extend the usage of his quirk, though I don't really see why he'd need that. He's good enough without that stupid gadget, and I don't think he's even able to get more skilled. He's even better than his dad was by now. He interrupted himself with a longer sigh. He had a raging migraine, and rambling off like that didn't do him any big favors. "I take it the thing you've been working on this whole morning is said request?" May asked with a smirk. She knew he'd been getting pretty bad headaches, probably one of the side effects of his growth spurt. Izuku hummed a low and skillfully massaged his temples. He couldn't even close his eyes before he noticed a pair of soft blue Converse stood at the entrance of the workshop. The blissful silence only lasted for a few moments. "Staying inside for so long can't be good for you, Izuku." The oh-so-familiar stoic tone filled the quiet room. "Thought you were still at your dad's? Don't change the subject, I know what you're trying to do." Shoto approached the duo, sitting down on the floor in front of them after watching out for numerous blueprints and the bolts that had fallen out of Izuku's pockets previously. "But I had a rough image of what you were going to do the second I messaged you about my idea yesterday. So here I am, confirming my doubts." Izuku knew he definitely didn't mean it as a jibe or something like that, but he couldn't help but to feel guilty about making him leave his home just to see Izuku overworking himself to yet another burnout. "And besides, not like I really wanted to be with my old man, it was just that both Fuyumi and Natsuo had gotten invitations to some college party, reuniting and celebrating or something. Plus Mom is still at her relatives'. That left only me to take care of him. Don't worry about me being here so early." Shoto's reassurance didn't do much to ease his overthinking, but he allowed himself to feel a little relieved. He stared at his sneakers, wondering how some of the stains had reached the soles. "I think you two should go outside. I'm sure the teachers will grant you permission." Izuku guessed the dual-colored boy nodded by the lack of audible response to May's horrifying suggestion. He did not appreciate them ganging up on him like that, but he did appreciate their care, although he was doing perfectly fine. May and he became quickly friends due to their alike nature, but also because both of them were bullied in middle school. Her classmates hadn't gone along well with the pink-haired girl's kind. They'd thought she was weird, and some even had went as far as describing her as psychotic, for some odd reason. Sure, her straightforwardness could be too much at times, and she lacked the skill of normal communication, but getting used to it, Izuku grew to like that a lot. He wasn't usually approached by anyone, so when May first appeared before him, he was perplexed, but mostly completely overjoyed. Both embraced each other's insecurities without really talking about it. "Quirkless. Bet we can make you into the first hero without a quirk, just with support items," she had exclaimed, excited with bright golden eyes when he had told her. "Isn't that like so cool? You're the minority, you're one of the 20%. That makes you so special, don't you think?" "I don't know, I haven't finished the dash." He stopped himself as he saw May whispering something into Shoto's left ear, who gave her a nod and stood up. Holding out a hand, he waited for Izuku to take it. The tall boy stared at the palm and then huffed. Shoto threw somewhat of a pleading look over to May, who also got up, but crouched down enough to hook her forearms under Izuku's broad shoulders. She pulled him up as high as she could, not that she was missing the strength to drag his well-trained body upwards. She was quite built herself. It was just Izuku standing his 205 meters that made it close to impossible to set him straight up by her own. So she just had the boy slumped over her head as he turned around. She had to admit, it was pretty comfortable like that, but she was sure he didn't enjoy his height as much as others did. Thanks to him sitting most of the time slouched over a desk, doing whatnot, he also had spiking back pain. And he strongly refused to wear his assigned corset as a pain reliever. Can't work on sheet with that thing. He took his free will into the option of creating his own back support, which he didn't wear either. It wasn't as bad as it sounded, just on some days Izuku had to forcefully pause his projects before his spine gave up on him. "Come on you big baby, it's so nice outside right now," she tried as Izuku seemed to melt over her. Again, not like she didn't have the muscles, but a 2 meters tall, buffed-up guy like Izuku was bound to bury anyone under himself. Noticing her struggle, he straightened himself as much as his back granted him to. He regretted sitting over his desk the whole morning now. Much less than degree much greater than. After agreeing May would stay back at the workshop, she was also a maniac about pasting blueprints into actual items, but to some degree less obsessed than Izuku. After her burnout in their first year, she'd set herself some rules to not go overboard, unlike the male, who had the inhumane ability to work through a burnout and past it. Shoto managed to succeed in dragging Izuku outside. For the first time in the week he was here. The heterochromic boy pulled him off school grounds with power loaders and Aizawa's permission, and both students made their way to somewhere Izuku had no idea. And he knew it was no use asking him about it. Shoto was determined to keep his little secret. So he tried to wiggle his wrist out of his tight grasp, long after realizing it was no use. "Stop whining, Izuku." The addressed boy groaned, a tad bit louder than his migraine would have liked it, and settled on shutting up. For now. He was aware of how there was no way out of this nightmare, a stroll outside, because Shoto's determination was the very first thing he was greeted with when befriending him, or rather, the young hero befriended Izuku. Degree. After the war around a year ago, which he only had roughly perceived due to the fact he had developed the coffin in the sky alongside May, and has later been filled in by documentaries and gossip and news reports and the repair of UA High plus its campus, Izuku had finally made his first actual friend outside his class. He was only friends with May there. Shoto had kept on pestering the entire support course about his costume, that couldn't handle the temperatures of his quirk and seemed to melt on one side and harden on the other. The fabric was unable to keep up with him anymore. It had taken him a little over a month until Izuku had gotten his hands on it, and replaced the malfunctioning material with a thin layer of ceramic-impregnated fabric in less than half an hour. To Izuku's introverted dismay, Shoto had made it his mission to repay him in some way, although he'd insisted it was fine. "It's my job." Shoto had not cut loose. So after some unwanted social events and even more unwanted outdoor activities, Izuku had embraced the elevation of the boys' presence. Whilst they didn't share the same classes and the certitude of the tall boy despising being anywhere but his desk, they rarely saw each other. Shoto was satisfied with Izuku seeing them as friends though, and he wasn't the type of guy who spent a lot of time around people anyway. Degree. The bright daylight, the young engineer was forced into shone straight upon Muzutafu with not a single cloud disturbing the soft cerulean-shaded sky. Walking down the narrow road, he spotted multiple small shops and cozy cafes, tall birch trees decorating the buildings. Broad flower beads stood like whimsical railings at the edge of the old pavement. Lanterns reaching up to first stories of some houses were set up to hang over the street, where cars drove by infrequently. The groaning teenager found a slightly dilapidated-looking, humble restaurant at the end of the road Shoto appeared to draw closer to. It didn't look really special, tacky if anything, but the atmosphere compelled him to swallow down any nasty remark he was ready to offer. Izuku read the sign and gasped faintly, forgetting about any projects he absolutely had to get done. For the time being, at least. Golden Kastuden. He heard Shoto's calm tone assert matter-of-factly and felt salty tears prickling at his eyes. He still hated his habit of being such a crybaby, even if he wailed far less than in middle school. But May secretly liked seeing him break through his tough exterior, not that she ever mentioned it. "You didn't have to," he trailed off before his voice could break. He felt incredibly grateful for his friend bringing him here, even if he was grousing through the whole walk. It was Mei's idea. She had been looking for spots like this, you know. She's worrying about you. The half-and-half boy turned to rest his assuring gaze over Izuku's freckled face. So am I. Izuku didn't know how to reply, so he nodded and gestured for him to enter the restaurant first as he held up the glass door at its top. Settling down inside the small shop on a soft couch and a cushioned seat at the left corner right next to the door, the two students grabbed themselves each a lightly faded-out menu. After ordering whatever their hearts and stomachs desired, they relaxed into their soft seats and talked about anything that lingered in their minds. With Shoto sitting on the wooden chair, he had a nice view behind Izuku. Large windows replaced walls and were only occasionally interrupted by dark red pillars carrying dim lights. Outside, he could see UA in the background behind apartment complexes and shop establishments and the high willow tree next to the little restaurant. The sun lighting up the interior deemed the lowly lit lamps as useless. The street was still, little amount of vehicles crossing it at the quiet Saturday noon. Izuku observed the inside. Only 3 other customers sat across the cozy place. The couch was dragged along the whole wall, or rather window, and various, differently sized plushies and pillows served as both decoration and bulwark between other customers. The square-formed tables carried each a box with multiple black, solid chopsticks and a scraped holder for tissues out of cheap metal, accompanied by a salt shaker and another container he couldn't make out its contents from. Big pots with tall growing flowers in dissimilar, warm colors stood at the entrance on both sides. The kitchen door was hidden away by the counter, more menus scattered over it and a few salt shakers placed right beside the window wall. That was like the best katsudon I ever had. Sides my mom's, course. Izuku sighed content as they walked back to school gowns. Well, Shoto walked, the green-haired boy staggered over the pavement, careful to not actually crash into one of the many flower beads. I read it's a family business. Their recipes are secret and apparently super old too, Shoto stated. I hope they deliver, good God. Izuku hummed to himself and shoved his rough hands deep into the pockets of the lower half of his dirty blue overall. He made a mental note on collecting the bolts that had fallen out of his side pockets earlier this day. Katsuki moved his right heel into the thin air, delivering a strong side kick across Gym Gamma, where he got his permission to train inside by Aizawa. The compact Bluetooth speaker sitting next to his water bottle blared Radiohead's "Creep" from the far left wall. He sat his foot back down and huffed out a weary sigh. He'd been training the entire noon with 3 20-minute breaks. After contemplating whether he should find his exercise sufficient, Katsuki nodded to himself and approached his belongings. Grabbing his orange music box, he turned it off and sunk down against the wall. As he sat down, he snatched his water bottle and dragged a refreshing mouthful of the cold liquid into his throat. Slouching against the cold concrete surface like that, the blonde trailed the white lines out of expensive coloring sloppily with an index finger. He was a tad bit tired. He hadn't slept this night, instead spending the dark hours with Kirishima, who had coincidentally moved back to the dorms the same day as him, in the common room, watching random movies and talking about whatever. Even if Katsuki would never admit it out loud in a billion years, he'd missed his stupid best friend. He was kind of happy with the fact the other extras, the rest of his friend group, didn't arrive yet. They were probably busy with staying up the nights and sleeping through the days, or whatever the dumbass would do in holidays. Who knew, really? His mind wandered to a few of his classmates that had already gotten back to the High Alliance dorm system. Especially Todoroki. Not that he cared, but where was the idiot going? He didn't have any friends outside 3A, at least to Katsuki's eye. But then again, he didn't care enough. It was just rare seeing the half-and-half BSTRD excited to leave the dormitory. As excited as the stoic boy could look, anyway. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding and forced himself up. Stomping his way toward his comfort space of a room, he was rudely stopped in his peaceful path as shitty hair popped up in front of him. "Where were you, dude? I searched the whole school for you." His booming voice reached Katsuki's faintly impaired hearing, luckily on his right ear, where he had around 30% of his hearing left. "Didn't search good enough, then?" He gave the redhead as a gruff answer and shoved him to the side to walk up to his floor again, but a firm grab on his wrist held him back. Come on, bro, Mina texted me that she'll get here in an hour or so. And, sides, it's lunchtime anyway. I'm hungry as hell. Katsuki tugged a little on his arm before groaning annoyed. The fridge is empty, we took out everything before the break, remember? Shitty hair added quickly, ruining the perfect opportunity for the explosive boy to retort to any nasty comments. I'm not cooking a hole, he growled, but his friend already pulled him forward to the kitchen. You literally just said we don't have shit to eat, what am I supposed to do? A 5-star meal out of the dust covering the entire counter with a side dish based on your stench. I showered this morning, don't say that stuff. Kirishima shivered comically but returned to a playful grin just a second later, after subtly checking if he actually emitted an unpleasant smell. He did not. I know you knew that. So I'm pretty sure of myself you brought some edible stuff along with your miserable self. Say that again, you lowlife? Katsuki chose to ignore how he was evidently becoming easier to read, at least by his currently frightened friend. Said boy hurriedly ducked down before an explosion could hit his freshly washed face. I'm sorry. Oh my god. I said I'm sorry. He cried out as Katsuki got a fistful of shirt collar into his hand. The young hero reluctantly let go and allowed shitty hair to neaten his pastel green flannel. Man, you gotta relax a bit, dude. It was just a joke, he whined, though still wary of his attacker. A bad one, he heard dulled by his side. He turned his head to the noise and found Katsuki poking his arms into the depths of the refrigerator. What are you doing? Getting the FING ingredients out, you asswipe. The committed cook spat and Kirishima decided on helping out wherever he was granted to. What the F are you doing? Izuku yelled through the whole development studio. Every poor soul that was present only shortly looked up toward the scene before continuing their respective projects. They were all used to the green-haired boy barking out cusses like that, particularly lately for some unknown reason. But the situation at Izuku's desk was truly atypical. For one, the grumpy teenager had his chair turned around so his back faced his disorganized workspace, which was strange enough as it was. Then, he was hunched over so that May could apparently F around and find out what to do with the slim scissors in her careful fingers. The maniac duo stared at the dark green, long curl that was lying on the floor in front of his sullied high-top sneakers. What the F dash? Izuku repeated, tearing his stare away from the concerningly long strand to glare into May's golden irises. She shrugged. What do you mean dash? He mocked her shrug, exaggerated after shrieking incomprehensible insults. Hey, I'm not done yet, the female tried, but Izuku buried his hair under his well-toned forearms already. Like hell I'm giving you another chance. I'm like basically bald in a spot now, bet? You don't know that, she countered optimistically, but he took it more like a threat than anything. I swear if there is, May. Okay, so you'll just walk around with a chunk of hair missing on your right side? I can fix it, believe me. I can also let you wander the streets with. She needed a second to restrain herself from accidentally letting out any possibly offensive comments. This. Izuku appeared deep in thoughts for a while, and then hesitantly set his arms back down into his lap. Fine, he groaned through a breath and fidgeted with a small fastener he'd fished out of his upper right side pocket, prior to his current predicament. His pink-haired friend obligated happily and to the boy's dismay, cut even more ringlets off until she shoved a mirror into his downcast field of vision 25 minutes later. My best work so far, May cackled with a proud stance, her hands stemmed against her hips. You've cut other people's hair? She heard him shuffling to some degree, lifting the handy mirror to get a proper look at himself. And good lord, May definitely knew what she was doing. His earlier bush of green curls had melted into an untamed, long wolf cut. Choppy layers and a messy texture showed off the short crown cut to create more volume, and the remaining layers on the sides and back were irregularly but somehow still methodized, left longer with unruly strands, giving the whole haircut a more disheveled mien to the middle of his back, where his longest strand sat. Okay, Izuku struggled to find the right words, or any words for that matter. IDMN. The green layers didn't hide the sides of his face anymore, and his sharp jawline somehow became extremely prominent to him. So did his neck, that winded nicely to his upper body. He wore his black tank top, so his collarbones artistically surrounded by sculpted muscles were revealed to the public eye to see, even if not much. His uncut hair had kept it all away from anyone's view. He swallowed dry and glanced up at May with a brittle peer. Thanks. He ruffled his front layers hesitantly. I'm not sorry for yelling earlier. May lunged at him with a broad grin, cautious of his back since he'd been sitting bent over something on his desk the entire afternoon again, and suffocated him in her chest like she always did. It didn't bother him anymore, but it was certainly something he had to get used to when they just had gotten to know each other. May. Izuku managed to press out in an attempt to get her to move a bit, at least out of his face. She didn't seem to have noticed his plight and rubbed one fist into his scalp harshly while still gripping on him like a lifeline with her other arm. Plopping down on his bed, Katsuki grabbed his phone and scrolled through some notifications he couldn't care less about to answer, mostly from Shitty Hair and the other extras. He had homework to do. He forced himself up involuntarily to his backpack he had just thrown into the corner of his room, right next to a wooden drawer and a few dumbbells piled up. Putting on his playlist on ear pods after taking out his hearing aid, it started with Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen massaging his eardrums in a durable volume. Wouldn't want to mess his right ear up even more. Or his left one, for that matter. He got to study for about an hour and a half until his delight of privacy was interrupted by a knock on his door. Thump. Into traffic, he whispered to whoever was on the other side of his room after getting up to approach his door. You want? He spat into Dunceface's frightened expression, who did not back the F off. Katsuki was proven once more how he didn't seem intimidating enough for someone like Fang Dunceface to take a step back, but he let it be for now. Geez, man, I just wanted your help on math. No one gets it and the other guys keep telling me to get your knowledge down to the common room, he whined. Katsuki dragged a hand across his face. Beneficially, at least for Kaminari's case, he was currently working on math. And honestly, he kind of did want to spend some time downstairs. But only because the air was better there. Definitely. Comet. Star operator. The next morning, Katsuki sat in his chair at the classroom, leaning his chin on his propped-up elbow and trying with all his might to ignore the ongoing chatter right FNG behind his butt. Apparently some moron from the support department was incredibly good-looking, and also a friend of Todoroki's. No wonder these two are friends, they're both such handsome boys, Raccoon Eyes squealed, causing Katsuki to heavily roll his eyes. To the ash blonde, it was fairly obvious that the mysterious guy was avoiding that kind of attention like the plague, but somehow that didn't turn out well for him. He even began to feel an ounce of empathy, since he could relate to the distaste of unwanted curiosity. Listening to the hot gossip, like the nosy little beach he was, he found out that the womanizer of a student was in the same year as they were, the third and last year of high school. So it amazed him even more that no one of his class had fussed over the rando beforehand. Though, from all the stories told over the past few days, he was able to form a rough idea. The mystery man had hidden himself away in the school's workshop and rarely ever was roaming around school grounds. That let the drop of empathy inside Katsuki grow to a spark, because the idiot's behavior showed even more how much he didn't want to be seen at all. Almost as he was either hiding himself or hiding from something. It was odd. And stupid. Stupid for the most part. Why trying so hard to be a loser? It was an enigma to him. So how did this enigma end up being spotted outside his hole? Katsuki shook his head softly, stopping the thought from roaming more in his mind. No way he was going to relate to some wimp that didn't have enough ball to step out into the broad FING daylight. He let out a strained breath and suppressed the urge to rip out anyone's vocal cords who had to talk about that DMN guy. He was getting so effing sick of it, that a-hole couldn't be looking so good to get the whole class worked up, for days one might add, could he? He didn't care anyway. The skeeling came to a halt as Aizawa shuffled in and announced the agenda for their exciting day. 2. It was at the lunch table when Katsuki finally snapped. Could you dumbass shut the hell up? For F's sake, that mystery man can't be that amazing. The entire table fell silent and a few students turned their heads to throw the blonde either annoyed or confused gapes. He felt uncomfortable under all the stares and lowered himself back into his seat he'd previously jumped out of. "Dude, calm down," Shitty Hair tried, but Katsuki swiftly barked back with a vitriolic, "I am calm." Yeah, sure, but for real, bro, did you even see that guy?" Dunt's face pointed with his thumb behind him to a wavering direction, probably meant to underline the door to the development studio at the end of the extensive hallway. "Don't need to see him to know that the fuss over him is so effing unnecessary. He's the guy Todoroki's been running off to." Couldn't care less. Now he was intrigued. "Just saying," Raccoon Eyes shrugged, "but he's a total hottie. I saw him yesterday with Todoroki when I walked past the workshop." "You'd know." "Oh, I definitely do." Katsuki continued munching away on his lunch without retorting to any remarks, at least until he spotted a pink-haired girl hurrying off out of the cafeteria with 2 food trays in her arms, one of them FNG loaded with katsudon. It wasn't really his business, but was she doing with 2 trays running outside the cafeteria? "What the hell?" he mumbled quietly, but audible enough for soy sauce to catch on. Right before she vanished behind the large iron doors of the school's workshop, Katsuki remembered Mei Hatsum from one of the 3 support courses. "Hey, she's friends with Prince Charming." The black-haired male shoved his elbow into Mina's side as he followed Katsuki's glare. "It's lunch break anyway, so why don't we wrap it up here and pay the development studio a visit? Stuff about improvements for our costumes or something." Raccoon Eyes winked playfully and glanced around the group, searching and finding agreement in everyone's faces. Katsuki rolled his crimson eyes. He did want some refinements on his suit. His gauntlets weren't storing his sweat as something had clogged the absorbers. As much as the teenager hated asking for help, he couldn't find the source of the issue, and DMN, he had been looking. Not adding any sort of approval nor refusal, he was dragged along the lively students up to the sturdy metal doors separating the hallway with the mess of a workshop. Although the noise was quieted by the heavy entrance, the muffled screaming of a music box and noisy metal clampering mixed with bold, loud voices emitted through the iron gate, additionally with dark gray smoke. "Yo, maybe we should drop by another TI." Dunt's face didn't get the chance to finish as Mina squirmed something among the lines of, "Ain't no way I'm going to miss my chance on watching a hottie in his habitat." The ash blondes started to regret their little adventure, but missed the opportunity to make a run for it, because both Shitty Hair and Raccoon Eyes stretched their fists out and knocked firmly on the double doors over-enthusiastically. A low F- roared through the workshop after a deafening metal clanking stretched up to the otherwise empty corridor. Katsuki groaned at the feedback he received on his right ear's hearing aid. He should mention it, he was getting sick of the feedback and his explosions contributed nicely to his predicament. He had asked the support department to work on something that could provide him less feedback and casual hearing a few days ago, anyway. Everyone took a step back as the entrance was ripped open by Hatsum covered in dust and small bruises. "Witness" by MSI played behind her back, probably at the highest possible volume the olive green, little Bluetooth box covered in scratches and old stickers could offer. Eyes scanning the messy room, Katsuki saw countless blueprints, tools and random materials carelessly thrown over the ground and the many tables. The music box was decorated with stickers of different pros, standing on a desk in the middle of the room. Another desk at the far left corner placed next to a huge, navy blue drawer filled to the brim with anything an ongoing engineer could use, caught his attention. Multiple white notebooks were scattered lazily across its surface, amongst them a notebook titled Number 13, that seemed like it had fallen victim to a fire or an explosion. He shook the idea out of his mind. He didn't feel like digging up old memories and the guilt that came along with them. Everything that had happened and the awful things he'd done and said were in the past. No use meddling over something that couldn't be reversed. Raccoon Eyes tilted her head next to him, trying to catch a glimpse of supposed Prince Charming, who appeared to be slipping away through a gray door leading further into the depths of the support department. All Katsuki noticed right before the door shut was a tall figure in a similar face mask Hatsum currently presented herself in front of the aspiring heroes. "We're pretty busy right now, what do you need?" The pink-haired maniac lifted the dark mask from her face. The group hesitated, no one of them in front of the workshop with an actual reasoning. So Katsuki took the burden on himself and stepped back forward, a scowl resting on his sharp features. "My hearing aid," he growled through gritted teeth. "Ah, Katsuki. Long time no see." The addressed boy clicked his tongue at the lack of his surname. "Hearing aid, huh?" Hatsum continued, disregarding his displeasure. She rubbed the back of her neck almost apologetically with her free, gloved hand. They won't be done until the weekend, sorry." Katsuki's frown deepened. "You said I can come get them at the beginning of this FNG week." He discerned a vein pulsating on his forehead. "Yeah, the guy who's in charge of them burned out again, huh?" Katsuki explicitly told Hatsum to not bring up his partial deaf right side to FNG anyone. He didn't want random people finding out he had a weakness as simple as that. Come on, he was Katsuki Fang Bakugo, a man with no weak spots. He trusted the girl enough to not spill the beans to a soul. Apparently a gaffe. Also, burned out again? What exactly was happening in the support course? Not that he gave adequate FS, but he sure as hell knew that couldn't be healthy. Don't worry about him though, he's always on some kinda edge nowadays. Just right now he's a bit fuzzy in the head, but totally capable of doing his thing. Get here on the weekend and the hearing aid is yours to wear, pinky promise. He didn't want no pinky promises, but his options to receive an improved hearing aid were a little narrowed. Hatsum, well, ostensibly now some other loser had been bullocking on assisting his hearing, not helping, assisting, after he'd injured his right eardrum in the big war a year ago. She the loser who'd been developing the assistive listening device, ALD, as she liked to word it, knew his peculiar preferences and how he specifically wanted it to look like, work, feel, the list goes on. So he couldn't really get up and go to somewhere else. Okay, he could, but he'd have to explain everything again and he wanted to avoid that kind of as much as possible. He only nodded after a few moments of silence between them. Before Hatsum vanished behind the huge, sturdy doors, she added with a somewhat acute expression and uncharacteristically weighty tone over her shoulder. "By the way, if you guys planned on coming here just to see my friend, give it up. He won't even get out of the workshop and dragging him to class has gotten even harder than usual. He doesn't appreciate the attention on him, so for the love of God, please, don't try to engage a conversation with him, he hates that stuff anyway. 2 burnouts in a row are not his limit." And with that, the pink-haired girl closed the suddenly very cold-looking door. Katsuki ruffled his blonde spikes. For days it was. Division times star operator division times star operator division times. During combat training after the regular classes, Katsuki had to forcibly sit out by the end of the lesson. His feedback had become too much to concentrate on the fight. Plus his gauntlets kept beaching. He forgot to mention them when he was standing in front of Hatsum yesterday, which was weird. He wasn't the forgetful type. Whatever. He set himself a mental note on mentioning his costume as soon as he'd get a hold of the DMN new hearing aid. So now he placed himself into the screening room next to Recovery Girl and half-heartedly listened to her occasional comments about the extras, while they could achieve more progress as time went on. Goddamn, Izawa and his stand aside for the sake of your eardrums bullshit. He only compelled because he had some bits of awareness of his unfortunate FNG situation and how overexerting his hearting could maybe cause more issues than benefits for him. So he'd interrupt training for not deafening out unreservedly. What FNG ever? How the thought of his gauntlets didn't cross his mind as he was greeted by the pink-haired maniac still amazed him to an extent. He had the weekend to spit his annoyance over the DMED things into her face anyway, so he should stop FNG mourning over that. It was Wednesday. 3 more days to wait, 2 days 3 if including today sitting out on combat. He clicked his tongue. Staroperator.headphone.staroperator. 2 days and 1 more afternoon, 2 if he counted this one, without hero class. He spent the warm hours by himself working out in Gym Gamma, after Izawa agreed with Katsuki swearing to any deity out there to not go overboard, because he couldn't just sit there and not do bullshit. Lights Out, by MSI echoed from his compact music box through the otherwise empty gymnasium. The explosive boy lip-synced to the equally explosive song and focused on producing as many tiny blasts his sweat glands allowed him. They were both easier on his malfunctioning hearing aid and his arms and shoulders, which would usually experience painful throbbing as drawback to larger explosions. He repeated the same process of individual training on Friday and smirked by the time he had finished his session. Content with himself and with his new move. It wasn't all too powerful, but it sure as F would confuse the enemy. The little explosions could last a solid 5 minutes with no break and would eventually result in a sheet load of intentional smoke he could resort into in order to prepare himself for a bigger blast. The only downside was that as much as the smoke would hide his presence, it would also leave the enemy the option of an escape. Luckily, he was more than able to activate his ultimates a lot faster, like his howitzer or cluster, which he preferred using only in horrible emergencies but nonetheless perfected over the months to reduce the liabilities, or his simple AP shot, or the even simpler stun grenade. He had a large assortment to choose from. Very much less than asterisk operator. Asterisk operator very much greater than. Izuku burned out. It did sound unpleasant, but that was nothing the boy and his friends for that matter wasn't used to. The first time the sudden exhaustion covered its apparition around his ever-racing mind was caused by the inhumane workload he voluntarily took on himself, and he sat through it at his desk, sometimes deep into the late hours, despite May's demands to just go and sleep it out. She left it at the singular yell when he snarled at her to just get away from him. Izuku burned out right after that once more thanks to the sudden attention he gained out of the blue. He swore to never step a foot outside ever again. All it took was a stupid walk to a stupid restaurant and all eyes were latched on him for the following days like flies on a pile of rotten fruits. Rotten, moldy, and forgotten. He knew he was overreacting. Who wouldn't want all the accreditation after being looked over for his whole life? Well, Izuku. Standing in the spotlight was like standing in front of a fast-approaching bullet train while being cornered to only the train tracks, at least for him. He hated it. He hated it so much his subconsciousness decided to take a break. By force seemingly. He wasn't used to it, to put it simplified, being humiliated during his entire childhood by people who formerly were oh so dear to him and turned a cold shoulder by them. It felt to him as if all the gazes and stares and eyes and looks were patiently waiting for him to make a mistake, to prove that all the dumb glazing was over the top and wasted on a loser like him, a quirkless one if we're at it. And maybe in another universe, the middle school bullying and playground tyrannization hadn't left an ugly, never-healing scar to his spirit. But in this one, this cruel, unforgiving one, he'd have to live with it. He'd have to SCK it up. Though unlike in middle school, he had friends now. He had Shoto, he had May, he had his knack for crafting support items that had him wrapped around its unexisting fingers like a thin thread close to ripping. It held him together, and although it was also the reason for the most of his burnouts, creating hero gear was the only element keeping him grounded. Not even May could muster the same effect on him. So even if he sat over his chaotic table, unable to form a coherent sentence without gripping at the roots of his forest green curls or barking at anyone who dared to get remotely close to the teenager, he would have something on his desk to keep him from going completely and utterly nuts. Everyone who was familiar with Izuku was familiar with his mental state. If they wanted to get to know Izuku, then it had to be the whole package. They knew it was nowhere a healthy coping mechanism to sit through a DM in burnout, but he refused to accept the help he was offered. He was fine, he was doing all right, he was going to get better, he wasn't weak. The only two people left that could at least try to scream some sense into him were May and Shoto, but even they were pushed further away by the time. He didn't want his only friends to see him like that, the only people who tolerated him. Weak and pathetic and in shambles and at his absolute lowest and worst. He couldn't allow himself letting them see him how helpless he could get. They would just leave him, not wanting to spend time around an emotional wreck, an utter moron like he was. A defenseless Izuku. What if they'd tell him to kill himself too? He couldn't afford losing these two, oh God, not them. He wouldn't be able to take it. He wouldn't be able to take another friend abandoning him to the lonely, sorrowful world of reality. Leaving him to his pitiable, shameful and so disgustingly deplorable state of despondency. Not from them, no, he wouldn't sit through something like that again. It already had left him in a havoc when he was 4. Not a chance he'd sit through it non-compulsory. Cherry blossom? A filled-out request sheet was gently slid into Izuku's field of vision from the side, where Mei stood with a somewhat repentant mien smeared into her typically joyous face, which he didn't notice. Too focused on distracting himself with more handwork. It didn't take him too long to get a hold on the paper. That hearing aid again? Goddammit, that's like, what, the 5th time now, he grumbled, but nevertheless read through it with particular care. Bullet operator? Truth to be told, Mei had never lost a word about who the hearing aid Izuku worked on so diligently was belonging to. He never bothered asking, both to her gratitude and dismay. And it surprised her every time just how few fellow students he actually knew. He always forced her to hand out the items he'd finished, since he disliked human contact to such an incredible extent she couldn't even fathom was humanly possible. Apparently it was, and how it was. If he wasn't in the development studio, which was a sparse occurrence by itself, he was in his dorm room either cramming last minute for upcoming exams or sleeping the day away. He could sleep anywhere, really. A talent Mei aspired to achieve with her sensitive slumbers. Or maybe all the all-nighters he'd pull would cause his body to force him into the very much-needed rest. She could resemble his personal caretaker if it weren't for them being so close. Additionally to not sleeping at the time any partially sane person would aspire, he sometimes forgot to eat too. He was aware of how if he wanted to keep his hulking physique, he'd need the nutrition. More of that due to his height too, and his fast metabolism also played rather less of a minor role. He'd have to get on the calories if he didn't want to lose his hard-worked-for muscle mass. Mei kept blankets around the dorms and the workshop, ready for them to cover Izuku's sleeping form anywhere he'd go and pass out cold. Not a lot of places, considering all spots the male would stay in longer than 5 minutes were obviously the workshop, the dorms, and their classroom. Izuku wasn't much of a people person either, if it wasn't evident enough. His middle school experience with classmates wasn't too happy-go-lucky. He had preferred staying by himself most of the time before Mei quickly approached him. To this day, Izuku's mindscape was a mystery to her, and that had to mean something. Much less than, much greater than. She didn't inform him about the user of the hearing aid. She didn't want to be the cause of a heavy relapse. She lived with that secret, which wasn't really a secret, but it might as well could have been. It didn't mean the guilt wasn't burning itself into her consciousness. Izuku had precisely recited how Katsuki had made his life living hell just for the fun of it. She couldn't bring it over her heart to apprise the boy of how he'd been developing a nearly flawless hearing aid for the guy that downright tormented him, for such a long time too now ever since the war had been won on their side. The woe emerged one day as the tall boy snatched a request sheet with neat handwriting from Mei's grasp, asking for an extension of 40% on the person's right ear right after all students were allowed back on school grounds. Izuku had always liked better specifying his virtuosity on singular people rather than Mei, who worked on projects regarding convenience and strength for anybody. Although the two could handle both fields as good as the other, the boy preferred focusing on the quirk of the wielder, while she emphasized building all sorts of support items for the generic use. Briefly, power of quirks was Izuku's thing, innovations that could benefit the holder were Mei's. So she'd let him have the task after it had been clear he wouldn't ask for who exactly it would be constructed. One time wouldn't hurt, right? Izuku didn't hand over the support items at the end anyway, so he wouldn't even be meeting the one responsible for his state of self-awareness. She hadn't expected another request sheet with the same handwriting rolling in a few months later, asking for improvements on the cursed thing. And naturally, Izuku had taken the DMN paper insisting on filling the request since he'd have the experience with it. Mei had let him. She had let 2 more times more. Izuku liked having to be cautious while modifying small units. He liked having to be scrupulous with every little wiggle of his fingers while trying to refine the experiment in front of him under his hunched torso. Mei sikidi it up. She was so unbelievably worried about him, but it never seemed implausible, never out of place. She didn't trust a word when he held his speeches and monologues of how he was old enough to look after himself and wasn't in need of a nanny. He wasn't giving damsel in distress. He was so self-destructive, it drove her up the DMN walls. He was doing it subconsciously, but he was nonetheless doing it. She couldn't just take his temporarily source of euphoria to her, a delirium. She never lost a word about her worry. She accepted his clamors to stay away from him when he'd break down again. She would only approach him to give him food if he'd forget eating again, or the pills against his migraines if those were prominent again. She brought him food and water and the medication, and his corset if he couldn't sit up straight, and soothe him to some degree if he was hyperventilating, yet again the latter only if the green-haired teenager would countenance to it. She always wavered for a few short moments before knocking on his door of his dorm room to check up on him. She loved him so much, and it pained her so terribly to see him like this, when she knew how he was back in their first year. Back when he had that gentle and attentive spark and observed every single itty-bitty detail about something so insignificant no one had noticed before him, even if that spark was short-lived. She couldn't bring herself to open her mouth and just tell him on the side, "Hey, so you've been developing a hearing aid for the guy who hates you like nothing else and pushed you into that fragile self-consciousness for a year now, yeah?" She adored him too much to break his heart like that, even if she knew that he would find out someday. She hoped the day would arise far into the future, like maybe another lifetime. He probably wouldn't take it too well. Who was she kidding? He would be devastated to say the least. May giggled awkwardly, an unfamiliar sound to both of them. But she couldn't put a facade over the iniquity she had been covering up so sedulously anymore. She felt awful and she could barely do something about it. Tell Izuku she kept shut about how Katsuki was the owner of the hearing aid? Or continuing to be silent about it and let her dishonesty come back to bite her in the butt later? She chose latter and begged to the holy spirits out there that later could maybe, possibly, perchance, please turn into a never. It's not too compatible with the person's quirk, huh? The words just spilled out of her mouth and she was ready to kill Izuku and then herself, because why in the ever-loving F did she just make it so obvious? What kind of quirk causes a DMN hearing aid to act up like it's stated in here? He tapped the sheet he held up with his middle finger, not looking up from it. May didn't want to lie. Not mentioning a major fact is one thing, but straight up lying about it was a whole another dimension she definitely would not enter, no matter the circumstances. Something loud. She stared anywhere but Izuku, and oh wow, would you look at that, the fluorescents flickered on the ceiling, they'd need to be renewed. Explosions or something, she whispered at Izuku's firm glare. She felt so horrible, someone make it stop. What? He encouraged in a somewhat kind tone, as kind as he could manage with 3 hours of sleep in total and at 11 in the evening. No, she couldn't ruin him. It was either her only rule she ever went by or her friend, who she could risk actually losing if she spat out what she'd been holding back. She sighed and returned his gaze with a pacific smile. Like she was trying to apologize with an expression for what she was about to say. Parabolic hearing. He can focus his hearing on certain areas and filter unwanted noises out. Comes with the drawback of when overdoing it, for example trying to filter a lot of sounds, the electrical signals will multiply and his brain has too many interpretations to choose from, so it decides on incredibly loud shrilling. She held her breath. If she wanted to be convincing, she had to make up the entire thing, not just the drawbacks and abilities. And Izuku being so aware of all the quirks there was out in the world, it had to be something fully different than what Katsuki had. And something that sounded like an actual quirk with actual drawbacks that were coincidentally aligned with Katsuki's. Which they didn't, she realized a tad bit too late. But that doesn't fit the request, May, the tall boy confirmed her panicked doubt. She was ready to preach her goodbyes. He explained it very vague, but that's his wish, so it seems, she pointed at the writing. You can ask him personally about if you want to know it so badly. The hope she began regaining quickly crumbled apart as he nodded. You know what, I think I'll actually do that. There's no way it's the 5th time he sends a request in. Maybe he's a bit of a moron so he doesn't understand his own quirk, he joked with a tired grin. She felt her mouth run dry. This was it. The ultimate proof lying would get you nowhere except a little deeper into the corner you've driven yourself into. No. Izuku shot her an inquisitive eyeful. She sensed her heart beating out of its healthy rhythm. With the volume of everyone being able to perceive it, she was certain of that much. What do you mean, no? He squinted in an attempt to see the inducement behind her frankly quite suspicious conclusion. Mei swallowed dry and thought about who to dedicate her will to. Probably Izuku. Oh, the irony. I mean he's not here. Her delicate fingers found the hem of her dirty tank top to fidget with. How did he send this then? The tired student flicked his index finger over the paper that began to crankle in his fierce grasp. He was getting behind her lie, and Mei did most definitely not know how to handle that actually. I gave it to you a little late, huh? She nervously cracked the joints in her fingers, not being able to keep them still. A nasty habit she had when she was put in awkward situations, and as much as she tried to conceal her hand somewhere, anywhere, she was aware that Izuku certainly caught on that something had to be wrong. He, got sick? Great, Mei. Make sure he is assured and cognizant of me spouting bullshit? Awesome, really. Not sure, he just told me he wasn't doing too well and that I shouldn't worry about him and all that stuff, you know. She let out a forced cackle and prayed that it didn't sound too strained. She heard a heavy sigh before she looked back into the emerald orbs. She felt so horrible lying to. Fine, I'll ask that guy the next time he sends in another request, 'cause that won't take too long anyway. Don't tell me you're going to make the thing malfunction on purpose? The repentant ate away at her nonetheless, but she was thankful that Izuku gave her the option of a change of topic. She pushed the guilt that came with that thought away as far as she could for now. God, no, Mei, how do you think of me? The male rubbed on his temples softly. I think you are in desperate need of at least a good demon nap, she quipped before he could add anything that would send her already sour mood down the drain, along with the efforts of covering up the ugly truth she tried to stash away so wretched. Maybe. She heard him agree to take a nap as often as she saw him step a foot outside of the development studio. Basically never. Her golden, somewhat frightened gaze widened a little, until she processed his concord and grabbed his strong forearm harshly. Really? You'll go to sleep willingly? A moment in history. Record it. I didn't agree. I can still keep going. That guy can't hear properly. Like hell I'll let him run around with his fuckus ears when he could be having full capacity of his senses. His tone signalized her there was no room for any further discussions. Mei let go of his arm. She regretted showing him the fuckus paper so late at a Friday evening, but she'd already promised Katsuki he would get the stupid aid by the weekend, so she refused with her consciousness screaming at her to say anything that could from his opinion anywhere. Although that didn't mean Izuku had to work on the aid through the night, he apparently insisted to. He didn't even know about the hypothetical deadline, plus he originally had the reassurance of the fictional guy who needed it was sick, so he technically didn't even have to work on it. Mei could rip her hair out from the frustration over her scrambled mind if it wasn't so precious to her. Well, she took good care of it, and even if it would get some drops of motor oil splat over it, her pink waves were the first thing she'd wash when she went to shower off all the remains of a long day in the workshop. In case she found the time for a shower. She knew there was no way she could talk him out of reconstructing the LD as soon as the boy turned with his seat to his desk and slumped over the crinkled sheet. She groaned once again, for the 25th time this night or so. She had to find a way to get him out of the workshop tomorrow, because she was definite of him being done with the FNG thing in a decent while into the late or rather early hours. And by the determination of Katsuki wanting a proper hearing aid, he would defiantly show up to rip it out of her hands as soon as he'd lay his eyes on his dark red box he'd been having his aid inside. Oh, how she hated her scrambled mind. Saturday. Mei found herself considering to convert to Christianity by the amount of prayers she'd sent to unknown upper beings, let alone in the 30 minutes she'd been awake. Because Izuku wasn't in his dorm room. He wasn't in his bed. Not even laying uncomfortably over his study desk opposite from his bed. Empty room. Good Lord, may he protect both him and Mei and probably Katsuki too, because as sweet as Izuku could be, she wasn't entirely sure whether he would actually refrain from breaking Katsuki's ribs. And Izuku's punches weren't something you'd take lightly. You'd have to be made out of pure steel, raw willpower and firm resolution to brush off the massage on your bones. Mei had been described often enough what Izuku was ready to do to him once he'd get his hands on the little lunatic. And deplorably, she did not have the strength to hold him back, especially not if he would be blind to anything else beside his incredibly deep hatred toward the blonde. She had to take a breath before she could think about her next course of action. Somehow lure Izuku out of the development studio, shove Katsuki's hearing aid into his awaiting grasp and make it absolutely certain that the two wouldn't see each other during the whole process. To say she hurried to their study was an understatement. She set a new record for the time required to get from the dorm to the workshop and ripped open the sturdy, metal entrance as heedful as she could, since she was fully awaiting to see Izuku laying on his table. And he was, head in his toned arms, snoring next to the finished product. His forest green hair was sprawled over his face, and May found herself wondering how he was able to breathe. Originally, the hearing aid had a small container, but she had it stashed away seeing as Katsuki's name was engraved in a corner subtly. Izuku was pedantic enough he would find the dark Bakugo with little to no effort, and then hell would break loose. Hell would break loose on matter what, because she stood behind the sleeping boy with two options to choose from, and both were undoubtedly not to her favor. 1. Not wake Izuku up, that left her with the hopeful 50-50 of either him staying asleep, or as far as her luck would carry her Izuku stirring, catching Katsuki's attention, and she wasn't going to test the waters of finding out whether that would go well. Knowing the loud blonde somewhat, he'd bark with enough volume to pull Izuku out of his slumber. Or number 2. Wake Izuku up and face the impossible task of persuading him into going to his diamond bed already. But that was such a drag, both waking the boy up and arguing with him to consider accepting basic human needs. She didn't want to put him through more exertion as he was in. She could lie again and say they'd have a test on Monday, but she was fed up with the pretenses leaving her lips. Yeah, alright, she was in somewhat bottomless sheet. May plummeted down on the messy ground, unsure whether she wanted to wake Izuku up with her sudden fall or not, because it was noisy enough. She was so ready to just rot away into the building and vanish, when a pair of heterochromic eyes leaned down into her sight and feign whispering calling out to her, probably. She couldn't really tell. May! The whispers grew hesitant with the time, as if he wasn't positive his voice was reaching her, before she whipped her head to Shoto. If she wouldn't know him, she wouldn't notice the slight panic laced into the boy's tone, even if it was distant. We're effed. I'm effed. I'm so effed it's not even funny. It's all over. Shoto blinked briskly before draping one arm gently over her shoulders in an attempt to soothe her. He tried getting along with her devastated mutters. What are you talking about? Matey in a sharp breath, interrupting his questioning. Aizu had been working on Katsuki's hearing aid and I didn't tell him it was his, 'cause I thought it'd be a one-time thing, but it wasn't, and Katsuki's supposed to get the aid today and I can't let them see each other because why would I let Aizu suffer like that, but I have not a single clue on what to do. The words poured out of her mouth like vomit and she was remarkably close to making that literal. She hadn't told anyone about her self-caused predicament, but she couldn't find it in herself to keep it for herself any longer. Shoto knew of the astonishing hatred that Izuku kept against Katsuki, so he was the only guy in question she was able to involve into her quandary. When will he be here? Was all that she perceived after a silence too long for her tastes. The pink-haired girl shrugged and brought her knees up to her chest to rest her head on them. She felt guilty, sure, the usual, but this time also hopeless. She should have argued with Izuku yesterday, when she still had a chance of not feeling this utterly demoralized. What a bummer. In case Izuku wakes up, I can distract him a little. You're forgetting you're not his only friend. She could hear the placatory smile in the boy's tone. She chuckled quietly to herself at that. She did forget. You're right. I don't have the time to mop around anyway. She hoisted herself back up again with the help of a nearby desk and stemmed her hands onto her hips. Her signature stance. Glad you're so quick back to being yourself, but I'd rather be silent. He pointed at Izuku's sleeping form. Or do you plan on waking him up? May nodded, although she disliked the idea. Waking him up now and having you distract him is better than him fluttering awake to Katsuki's yelling. Because as much as Aizu hates that demon, he'd recognize him immediately. Shoto agreed with a nod. We don't have too many choices left anyway. He turned to Izuku's now stirring form as he rose slowly from his position. He yawned soundlessly. Both teenagers approached him with steady but nonetheless careful steps, mainly because there was so much rubbish laying around. Good morning, sunshine, May beamed best to her abilities at the sleep-drunken boy, who almost toppled over at the sudden presence right in front of him. What? He growled with a hoarse tone. His morning voice was one to melt even for May, although she had little to no interest in such things. Machines were her thing. You slept in here again, idiot. Now it was Shoto's turn to engage in something that could resemble a dialogue. Or persuasion, who knew, really? Go to your own bed. It has to be much more comfortable than whatever. He held himself back, that is. Aha. Izuku barely registered the two figures in front of him while he rubbed the sleep away from his half-lidded eyes. May and Shoto exchanged a glance. If they try to get him out of here, then now. Alrighty then. I'll handle the rest here, while Shoto here can take Y. Her heart stopped beating. Well, it seemed like that for a second, and she somehow wished it did. Because a firm knock paused her in whatever she was about to preach. Hey, how about we two put on some music and May gets to the door, no? Shoto barely suppressed the hectic dread in his tone as he shot the girl a decisive glare. But how would she know Katsuki would stand in front of the DMN development studio at FANG 9 in the DMN morning? Good idea, good idea. She nodded energetically through the sticker plastered previously as green as Izuku's hair Bluetooth box that was packed away in a drawer, across the room for Shoto to catch it and connect it to the tall, and currently very much confused boy's phone that was lying next to the modified hearing aid. As swiftly as he could manage, the dual-haired teenager tossed it to May as a trade for the music box, and both shook their heads a nod. The second he woke up from his dreamless beauty sleep, Katsuki bolted toward the dorm's kitchen, shoving breakfast down his throat and ignoring anyone who dared to approach, let alone talk to him. He threw on the first outfit he saw and deemed as good enough for a workshop visit, not like the morons over there were all tidied up anyway, and stomped his way toward his long-awaited hearing aid. He was so going to get that thing, even if it killed him. Even if it wasn't a long walk, he hated the quiet that came with it, so he pushed one wired earbud into his left ear, the functional one, and put on True by Spandau Ballet. Perfect length for his short morning walk, plus a nice song to his liking too. When he finally was met with the heavy metal gate separating him and his oh-so-dear hearing aid, he pushed the earbud into one pocket of his loose sweatpants. He knocked with a balled fist and waited. Even if it killed him. The entrance was bursted open by a very disheveled Hasjum, though it wasn't a rare occasion to see her this tousled. The look in her eyes was deranged to the extent of concerning him. To an extent. There you go, she boasted and moved the small, dark red box into his chest before he even had the chance of opening his mouth. Upon opening it, he was greeted by a compact hearing aid in the tone of his own skin, along with a crinkled, handwritten note. He swore he recognized the handwriting from somewhere, he just couldn't wrap his head around it. Not until a wave of repentance hit him, in company of an even stronger wave of hatred that he hadn't felt in a pretty damn long time. He couldn't figure out where the hatred was directed to though, and he had certainly no idea why he was feeling it in such an amount. The instructions, Hatsum brought him back to earth, although against his will. She seemed to notice his stare burning holes into the note. Katsuki gave her a nod. It's basically the same as before except with a bit more cushioning and as requested less feedback. He was ready to turn around and leave back to his safe space of a dorm room, already one earbud in his fingers, when his eyes set on red and white hair at the far left corner. Icy Hot sat cozily on the diamond floor next to a beat-up office chair-looking kind of seat. Said chair was occupied by a green-haired FNG skyscraper. The mystery man had his hair submerge his face, at least as much as Katsuki could see. Even if he was leaning far into the backrest, that a-hole had to be a minimum of 190 meters in height for his legs to dart out as much as they did. The moron's right side was turned to Katsuki, and the only thing he could make out clearly was a pair of red high-top sneakers almost reaching to the half-and-half BSRD, although he was sitting a good bit away from the DMN chair. Hatsum's monologue about something with the hearing aid faded into the background as he observed the two teenagers. This had to be the guy the idiot had been running off to. Only by now he heard Raven Leanie's "Love Me Not" emerging from the same green Bluetooth box he'd seen a few days ago. To his utter dismay, Icy Hot perceived his piercing glare as noticeable and only required his subtle side eye to confirm his thought. By this time, Hatsum had turned her whole body to face the peppermint-colored son of a beach, who was frantically shaking his head at the girl. So, that's a first. Katsuki quirked an eyebrow at the sight, and by the silence that followed the question coming from the overgrown extra, he turned in his seat. And holy shit, Katsuki wished he didn't. For a moment, everything was still. Hatsum's strained breathing was the only sound filling the workshop. Well, save for the green music box that decided to be a beach and play treehouse this exact moment. Alex G. Just this time, hell. A horrified and morbidly disgusted scowl met his widening, crimson irises. You know the look you get after saying something you defiantly should have kept to yourself? Like the location of the corpse you dug into the dirt next to a cabin in the woods or something? Like unintentionally insulting someone's entire bloodline but with extraordinarily trashy vocabulary? Good for you. Just imagine a repulsed and at the same time vehemently wrathful scowl directed at you by a person you didn't think you'd ever see again in your life and sort of prayed you wouldn't. Katsuki didn't even count it as probability for that kind of look in his face or eyes, for that matter. His stitched-up heart threatened to stop functioning with the beats per minute it was taking in the moment. Cold sweat ran down his entire body and a shiver bolted through his spine. He didn't want this. The freckled, sharp face he was forced to stare at wretched his consciousness. He didn't want this. The emerald eyes with no spark in them he was said to stare at punched him in the gut, straight into it, and he felt the bile rising up his throat. Apparently his breakfast wasn't worth it. Bakugo? A gruff, tired voice hissed ambivalent. Yeah, ambivalent he FING was. Something in Katsuki shifted. He didn't want this. And suddenly, Katsuki, the great Katsuki FN Bakugo, great explosion murder god. Dynamite, the man for every DM in PSS job, the FNG sheet, the one and motherfucking only he didn't feel all that marvelous and amazing and invincible anymore. Unbeknownst to anyone including Izuku himself, he did in fact develop a quirk. A mutation, though it wasn't too powerful, none of his parents nor other family members had such a quirk. One could say it was impossible. The doctor's X-ray 13 years ago showed clearly he did have 2 joints in his pinky toe curse his feet. But one could may as well claim the X-ray had been wrong. Whatever the case was, Izuku had developed a quirk over the time, which not a single soul was aware of. The ability to embed fragments of his own feelings regarding the person that carried the greatest emotional value to him, to that very same person. The certain fractions had to be vehement and could only be directed at said person. As long as that specific person is able to perceive Izuku with at least one of the 5 senses, the receiver will take notice of the feelings, albeit as a small spark. With the sender and the receiver spending more time around each other, the receiver would be able to discern more and stronger emotions, as their bond would grow. Only one person could become the receiver, and as destiny had foreseen it for them, Izuku unknowingly embedded vestiges of his own emotions to his receiver Katsuki, who was more than dumbfounded as to why he was feeling a particular distaste against something he couldn't name. Before he hated Katsuki to no end and the ash blonde was rather the one who loathed him, Izuku held no ounce of hostility to him. Even during the bullying. Even then, when the oh-so-astounding boy told Izuku, "Take a swan dive off of the roof of the building. Kaken is amazing. I hope, when I get my quirk, it's gonna be as cool as yours." But after graduating from Aldra Junior High, he found it a tad bit laborious not to abhor the suicide baiting against his former childhood friend turned a-hole. The quirk took its sweet time to flourish, and the admiration and adoration aimed at Katsuki surely were deep-seated and valid, but not ample, even if they were only held to his bully and nobody else. After being separate for 2 years, and growing the little spite against Katsuki into full-blown and disheartened abhorrence, Izuku hadn't found the need to change that. The admiration from where they were kids and friends was still resting far away somewhere in his heart, but the hatred was prominent and overshadowed any fleck of previous love there had ever been. Katsuki swallowed dryly. He did most definitely not anticipate Deku here. He actually didn't anticipate anything at the moment. His mind was blank save for 3 words racing in his mind. What the F dash? He had recognized himself as responsible for not seeing Deku around anywhere, especially before the school was introduced to the dorm system. He expected to at least catch a glimpse of that stupid freckled face somewhere near his street, since they lived moderately close to each other, but no. Not a single mutter ever had strained his, back then still fully functional, eardrums, and he'd found himself enjoying the peace. To a degree. Until he hadn't. He had seen himself at fault for the tranquility which was quite frankly plaguing him by the time he seriously began wondering just where the shitty nerd had been. But he never actually spared it much of a thought. At least that's what he persisted on telling himself, and Shitty Hair, who had unfortunately snooped in Katsuki's dorm room, found an old picture of him and Izuku, and the questions had been raining down on him, much to his dismay. Making the red-haired dumbass the only one who really knew anything about Katsuki before his absolute glory in Yue. And that he'd been the lowest scum on earth bullying a quirkless boy that had been his FANG childhood friend, for FS sake. Anyway, back to the business at hand, he apparently hadn't spared it enough thought of where Deku was possibly moping around. Well, right under his FANG nose, it seemed. Mei? What is he doing here? The question erupted somewhere behind the mortified and appalled girl. She looked ready to die, and Katsuki was more than prone to grant her that, as long as it would scrag him alongside. Hatsum turned toward the nearly fuming teenager, appearing like he was close to literally burn the place down with an unnamed simplicity of some kind of force. Katsuki was rarely ever impressed by something, and even if he was, he wouldn't admit it to himself, ever. Or very unusually. Katsuki was, honest to God, astonished by the self-control Deku was displaying. He couldn't fathom how he kept his clenched, trembling fists on his lap. The astonishment was quickly replaced with something resembling panic because Katsuki would never feel even close to alarmed, especially if it was shitty Deku. He was simply a little surprised when the seething FNG skyscraper rose from his beat-up-looking seat. The half-and-half BSRD threw Katsuki a concerned, possibly even worried stare. Not even enough anger to glare, wow. He kind of was in deep shit, wasn't he? Getting his stupid motherfucking hearing aid actually would get him to kick the bucket, who would have thought? Katsuki did not. Deku apparently recovered from the previous startle, and Katsuki started to believe he'd murdered a god in another life, because he didn't see why a 2-meter-tall, buffed-up Izuku Midoriya should be towering over him, ready to dissemble him with his bare hands. Luckily, his palms were gripping on Hatsum's shoulders. For her not so lucky, but Katsuki wasn't seeing a scenario of both of them making it alive out of this shitshow anyway. Or in one piece while we're at it. The hell, he was so effing tall, like really motherfuckingly tall. Like leaning over Hatsum with ease kind of tall, given she wasn't too big in height, but he could bury her under his brawly torso if he wanted to, like intimidating him kind of tall. But it wasn't just the moron's height, of course it wasn't. Deku's body was sculpted, to sugarcoat it. He had somehow managed to pull a tank top over his upper body. It stretched impossibly over his chest and abs, and in a very weak moment, Katsuki conceded that maybe, probably, most definitely, Izuku's chest could be puffier than his own. It was the DMN tank top, he was certain of that much. The DMN tank top in question hugged nicely around his collarbones, leading to broad shoulders, husky upper arms and burly forearms. His hips were wrapped into the sleeves of a pretty FING wide, dirty overall which had pockets on its legs, stuffed infinitely with whatever. Additionally, as if that wasn't enough already, the FNG nerd had his green curls cut into a shaggy wolf cut, draping over his neck untamed. Stop FNG staring and get into action, Katsuki? He gulped down nothing again and was sent back to the present, where Deku glared holes into Hatsum's face. Mei! His low, seemingly sleep-drunken voice sent shudders across Katsuki's skin. He didn't remember his voice doing that, actually. He also didn't remember his arms so FANG brawny, goddammit. Or his hands this large, or his Adam's apple sitting so prominent on his throat, sweat trickling down from the heat in the room in front of him, or his jaw line so sharp. Or how the infuriated glimmer in his otherwise empty emeralds shone like he was about to snap Hatsum's neck, yet his fists remained by his sides. Vehemence at its finest, yet Deku made no attempt to act upon it. He was so much more resilient than Katsuki, it amazed him. He would have lunged at anyone by now, because judging from the tension, he kind of exactly knew what was happening. Hatsum didn't tell him it was Katsuki's hearing aid he had been working on so diligently. And that resulted as a slight issue, since saying Deku hated his former bully now was the understatement of the century. Looking at the seething teenager, it was so definitely an understatement. The girl underneath Deku's grip trembled, probably not able to utter a single word. She was staring up at him with such profound perturbation, Katsuki wondered if she could even muster a thought. You lied. The nerd didn't sound mad, of course he didn't. Or he was, and just didn't display it that obvious. It was raw sadness and woe in his voice. Woe he's never heard expressed so palpably in a sentence with 2 words, so evidently. Wow, he must have been pretty embittered at just seeing Katsuki, that he'd look at his friend like this. Like she'd committed the worst sin on earth and heaven and hell and the whole FING universe, but 10 times in a row. Hatsum nodded so slow, so faintly, Katsuki wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't trained his senses to their limits and past that. Why? Shitty Deku breathed it out with a disheartened laugh, as if he couldn't believe it. Not yet. He just couldn't wrap his head around it. Hatsum stayed silent and shot her eyes down on the ground. Katsuki had never seen a person so discouraged like her, a person which was usually always so enthusiastic and energetic. Not even he had looked that miserable in the reflection of his mirror after the war. Get the F out of my workshop, Deku finally turned to face him, and it took Katsuki surprisingly a lot not to openly cower under the piercing scowl. More than he'd like to admit to himself. I'm not even inside, you moron. Katsuki chose to add his own fuel to the already boasting fire, because if life had to throw these scenarios at him, why not take the best out of them? Deku widened his eyes. Stepped into dog's hit, didn't I? Are you arguing with me right now? Right I am. The spark of the unexplainable loathing twisted further into his gut, growing uncomfortably. Where the hell was it coming from, anyway? For the presumably 20th time this morning, Katsuki swallowed the taste of nothing. What the F was that fragment of absolute abhorrence going on about? Moreover, whether he acknowledged it to himself or denied it vigorously, he wasn't holding any ounce of dislike to the demon nerd. Never did. The dislike was just misinterpreted envy, but that was for sure a tale he would recover another day. He was not ready to face that chunk, God no. A rare moment of honesty would cost him his dignity and his so well cared for pride, so no, he wouldn't even gaze into that direction. The circumstances would force the task now upon him, sooner or later. He was puzzled, dumbfounded and so motherfucking confused as to where the hatred came from, if it wasn't his. Maybe something like a memory? Wasn't that, if you would see a certain person you'd carried a special bond with, after a long while, you'd experience the according emotions? Too philosophical for his liking, hell no. I'm not gonna say it again, get out of my sight, Bakugo. The lack of his stupid nickname kicked him somewhere into his chest, and that hurt. It painted his face into an ugly grimace that he only noticed after the effing pepperminted bee blinked rapidly, astonished at the apparent boldness. The conversation between him and stupid Deku seemed to unlock new facial expressions for the boy. What the f? Are you grimacing for a hole? Get out before I'll do it for you. This morning was filled to the limit with surprises. Deku wouldn't ever say sheet against him, he didn't have the ball for such a stunt. Or he did, and just hid them really well, but that didn't seem plausible. He would have been standing up for himself against Katsuki's relentless terrorizing. He never did though. Another knife in his chest curled around his heart tranquilly. He felt compelled to oblige and turn around and sort of run the F away because what in the motherfucking F, which didn't seem right, at least not to his own standards. Going against his self-set principles wasn't how he'd done sheet, but repentant as he was of the behavior he acted with in front of the nerd, he found it rather troublesome to act without his so well-known attitude. They were inseparable, damn it. He wanted an end to the infinite seeming confusion. Just giving up wasn't his style. He'd stand to his rough demeanor, if it meant his demise, so be it. It looked like that in any case. He got what came here for, Now it was just a question of his ego, getting the F out of Deku's workshop and additionally getting the weird pang of utter resentment out of his chest for good, which felt like it would implode by now, just as a side note. Or standing in front of the seething giant and by the look of it possible risking a good number of broken bones while he'd be at it. Even if he was Katsuki and Bakugo, Deku's fists looked by heart not like they could be dodged, much to his pride's dismay. Recovery Girl's office was nearby, but he wasn't going to grant the shitty nerd the victory over a FING fist fight, the one he'd always won against his former childhood friend. Best friend, he heard little Izuku say somewhere buried away deep in his memories from years ago. Good God, he effed up big time, didn't he? An embarrassingly honest second later, he discovered he missed that time. He could accept defeat over a verbal fight against Izuku, at least this once. The boy had always been better with words anyway. From what he remembers, which could be wrong information too. Teeth gritting, he turned around and spat a small hifu, before stomping back into his dorm with the dark red box stuffed securely in his pocket. Katsuki had the wonderful opportunity to think about the last 6 minutes now. Great FING Lord. Ring operator. Bakugo left. With a glare and a hissed curse, but he finally left. Izuku was furious. For the most part. If he wouldn't have the little amount of decency and humane sanity residual, nobody would have been breathing their sacred oxygen anymore. Nobody would have been gaping up at him with raw fear and repentance, nobody could have been trying to approach him, and nobody would have been left standing to explain to him in detail what the F just happened. May. Her name fell from his lips the 100th time today, and he was awake since about 10 minutes. The development studio was quiet. So was the hallway and the entire world. And the solar system, the sparkly Milky Way, and their silly little galaxy. Save for Step on Me by the Cardigans. How funny really. The silence hurt. A lot. Like it hadn't in a long time. Izuku felt pitted like a toddler, like a dumb child that saw something it wasn't supposed to, like a dog whose owners left it on the side of some old road. Say something. His tone cracked the way he hated it the most. He would break into tears in a few minutes, maybe even seconds. His voice was barely anything above a pathetic whisper. Please. He felt hurt and betrayed because he was. May had every goddamn chance to tell him, though he saw why she didn't. She didn't want to hurt him. Again he made her worry over his sad existence, over something so unimportant. Just how much scorn had Bakugo drilled into him? He disgusted himself with those thoughts, those avoidable, weak thoughts that shouldn't be embracing him daily the way they were. What were they doing in his happy-go-lucky state of mind? His younger self would shatter at the sight of the despicable pile of chagrin mourning over his dream he'd thrown down the drain so early. May must have known this kind of situation would be taking place someday. She wasn't stupid. She must have known this would be the worst possible outcome, worse than if she'd just told him. Sure, telling him would hurt too, but it could prepare him to this exact situation, because at the moment, he had no idea what he should do. Probably turn off the Bluetooth box. The contemptible plea got May to shift and turn her gaze directly into his eyes, darting her golden orbs into dull emeralds. Dull emeralds filled with woe, so much woe it pushed her dinner up to her throat and her heart rate to somewhere an 18-year-old's pulse shouldn't be. She held her hands close to her chest, fiddling with her fingers nervously as if her life depended on the quick, clumsy twitches. Maybe it did. Izuku's raging form dropped down into an instead purely disappointed state, his face smeared with despair and tinged with indignation. He wasn't mad, just disappointed. Except he really was mad, but he pushed the anger aside for the time being as he glanced at the girl's trembling stance. She went and betrayed his trust. She broke the only rule she went by in her chaotic mess of a student's life, just for the sake of protecting Izuku. He didn't need it. He was strong enough. He was able to shield himself from any danger perfectly fine, without anyone interfering. She kept her mouth shut about the only thing that could seriously develop into an obstacle that he saw as an actual threat to his molding well-being. She went and lied. May lied to him she lied. May lied to Izuku. She promised she wouldn't. Ever. She insulted her own single rule for the shameful sake of not hurting him. Now see where that got her. Shoto stirred upwards from his seat on the ground, being the first one to move more than a turn of the head. He turned the Bluetooth box off, because Izuku couldn't hear another, "Do what you want with me." Drawing near Izuku, he hovered his right, colder palm over the freckled shoulder. "Did you know?" Izuku didn't bother eyeing him. Shoto planted his hand on the exposed skin. "She told me before you woke up just now. I had no idea." "Okay." Izuku nodded more to himself than the other two students standing timidly at both of his sides. "All right, okay." He didn't halt his nodding, not even when he could sense every single shake sending the physical state of his brain into a hysteric migraine, that feeling when you shake your head during a nice headache and you're absolutely convinced you can feel your brain swimming in its cerebrospinal fluid. Shoto removed his icy palm. "I will talk to Bakugo if you want me to," he offered after a dreadfully long silence. The boy next to him let out a noise that sounded like a suppressed groan. "I can speak for myself." He tried to not make his bark sound too derisively. "And, sides, what would I want to tell that self-centered a-hole? You know damn well I'm done chasing after the egoist." The stoic boy decided to keep his mouth shut. Izuku might didn't know it at the time, but Bakugo had developed into someone far apart from an egoist. But he kind of liked breathing air, so he'd swallow any utter down for now, at least. He noticed Izuku tensing up next to him, and found the conclusion, to let the two engineers sort their friction out without his presence, a very wise one. He parted his lips to say something, but instead transported himself to the heavy metal doors and left the apprehension-filled workshop with a guilt-ridden consciousness. Hey. She didn't want to hurt him, all right. But she did. Inconvenient. May you? Izuku inhaled sharply, as if to prevent anything to fall over his tongue that could worsen the situation, and honestly, that wouldn't be a snag, quite the opposite. He held himself back regarding anything that would impact May's current state, which could be round about everything that just happened and the evening before. He couldn't just blurt out, "You had every chance OT tell me," and be done with it. May would start to hyperventilate if she wasn't already, taking into account the labored, unrhythmic gasps she was pressing in and out of her lung in an attempt to get her brain back to circulate. Izuku sighed. It was his fault she had troubled herself with the lies. It was his fault she had broken her own, one and only rule she wanted to live by. It was his fault she had even thought about hiding the truth just so that his dumb feelings wouldn't be hurt. He had her worried. He still worried her. Due to the sole reason of him being so low and deplorable by himself to sort out his own problems. Now he seemingly went out of his way to give his friends mindsets of uncertainties and guide them gently into panic attacks. I should have just listened to Bakugo back in, okay? That would get him nowhere right now. He had to calm May down before her brain circulation would do it for her. Izuku let out another strained breath and lumbered towards her shaking body, wrapping his warm embrace around her after he confirmed with a hesitant glance whether she allowed it. She did, with a small nod. His defined arms held her close to his large form, trapping her leniently in the comforting smell of green tea and machine oil, and a tiny hint of the lavender May gifted him to his 17th birthday. Last summer, that he kept by his desk in the workshop and cared for like his biological child. He rubbed his calloused palms soothingly over the entirety of her back, where the trembling began to fade into manual, practiced lifts of her chest. It mollified her, and she leaned further onto his sturdy muscles. At least until Izuku realized what she was doing, because he knew May loved the human physique. And his was pretty DMN prominent, looking at Izuku. He let out a soft chuckle, partially out of relief she was back to being herself to some degree, and partially out of the stark contrast of her behavior, but he was used to that. So no wonder there. You better yet? Or wanna examine me more? May sniffled lightly and shook her head a yes, and then a no. Izuku let her go carefully. Avoiding his jades, she dragged the back of her hand under her nose. I'm sorry. I thought that maybe. Izuku interrupted her before she could explain anything, and much to her disapprobation, he said exactly what she'd been fretting him to say. I should be apologizing, not you. You worried about me for such a trivial issue that I shouldn't have concerned you to begin with. I should have just handled it on my own, but I bothered you with that bullshit, and now see where we got, just because I'm incapable of. he trailed off. Quickly shutting up after noticing what he'd said, he stared down at May expectantly, as if waiting for her to do something about the rambling that just spilled over his lips. Or much rather, start ridiculing him. Because that was the logical consequence, right? That was what followed up when you apparently willingly handed out the reason you're such a miserable loser, right? That was what was supposed to happen, though, since anything else wouldn't be plausible. At least from what was drilled into his head in elementary school and middle school and at the playground at the corner of his apartment complex. May stared back with wide gold. "Is that what you think?" she coaxed out, and Izuku was alarmed of a second panic attack, but he eased when she reached out to grab his hands. He couldn't answer in time as the pink-haired girl blurted out the next words that had him holding tears back. "Wow, what a surprise. I worry because I love you. Not because I think you can't do that by yourself. You can do plenty of stuff by yourself, so let us take a few things off your shoulders, won't you?" She offered him a pacific smile, but this one he knew it was filled with honesty and sincerity. "Let me worry about you." And of course, the tears came flooding down his freckles, staining his tank top with singular, fat drops. Now it was Izuku's turn to be comforted, and May placed one hand on the top of his head, messing up his already disheveled forest green bush of hair after he crouched down on the floor with a choked sob. "You really thought I saw you as weak? Come on, that's just mean at this point." She laughed and scooted closer when he pulled his knees to his chest and buried his face in his crooked arms. Typical crying position, what else to add? Maybe that he was wailing decently loud, but that was also the typical Izuku thing. Hey, come on." May shushed his cries and shuffled to sit by his side, leaning on his broad shoulder. "We can't just sit here all day crying to our heart's content." She closed her eyes in a relaxed manner and felt the movement of a hasty nod coming from the curled-up boy, but no sign for an end to the blubbering. "Or we can. Honestly, you need a break anyway." She was fairly astounded by the lack of objection. "A moment of history? Take a picture? You probably don't want to go outside in the next 20 years anyway, so why not make ourselves cozy in here?" Although she never received any kind of response, she knew he was listening. He told May once her voice would calm him down. "I can get some ice cream from the dorms." But what was it? Chocolate mint? God, who likes that? A soft giggle. A reassuring hand on his scalp. A weight leaning onto him. Izuku found himself pondering about what grounded him the most. Machines. Machines? He should rethink that. Chocolate mint is mouth-watering a whole. He shot back with a small, retiring smirk and leaned into her, causing her to virtually lose balance. She stemmed her hand into one of many rolled-up blueprints, wrinkling it a little. She couldn't care less right now, they had enough layouts. Pop star. Coco and Claire. 117-304. Resent? Couldn't be. Did he foil? Definitely. Devastation? So, of what? Vexation, frustration, vehemence? Vehemence. Vehemence? Go. Vehemence, that was what he was experiencing the past few days. At least he had a better hearing aid with less feedback. None at all, you liar. Akugo. Vehemence, but of what precisely? Confusion? Frustration? Repentance, and you know it, Diamond, well, asswipe. Earth to Bakugo? A hand waved right above his textbook, right under his downcast head, right in front of his eyes. The weird fragment of hatred was gone ever since he stomped the hallway down last week. 3 days ago, moron. But the knife twisting and turning further into his heart with every breath he took, with every second running past him, remained. Everything and everyone and their Diamond grandma seemed to fly past him, while he just shambled around reluctantly. Bakugo, more hectic this time. He felt another hand gripping on his shoulder, shaking him first gently, then with more force. Right, he was sitting in class. Oh, how he hated Tuesdays. The shaking grew stronger, before he whipped his head toward the bee, daring to disrupt his thinking time, only to find the school day as over. Shitty hair showed him a perturbed flicker in his carmine eyes. "Dude, you good? I've been calling your name for like 5 minutes now." The red-haired boy let go of his white dress shirt. 5 minutes wasn't much, was it? For calling someone's name it presumably was, though, no? Yeah, Katsuki replied briefly. Wow, no insult leaving his mouth, a spectacle. "Da you sure?" Shitty Hair stretched it with a concerned yet playful tone. Katsuki gave him a nod. He wasn't in the mood for talking. He wasn't in the mood for anything, actually. "You know you can always talk to me? About anything?" Katsuki decided to pack his things together, shoving his pencil case and notebooks and everything else resting on his desk roughly into his bag. He would go to his dorm room, do his homework, maybe study for the upcoming exams, and nap the sheet out of his bed. With the rare equanimity he'd gained around the time of the war, Katsuki shook his head a nod again. "I know, Shitty Hair." He threw his ash-blonde friend one last, timorous look and chose to shut up, packing away his own notebooks back into his backpack. Otherwise, the classroom was empty. Katsuki noticed it only by the uncharacteristic silence of the room. It was nice, so peaceful and so effing quiet for once, yet he couldn't get himself to enjoy the tranquility. It was too effing noisy in his head, memories buzzing around and his consciousness screaming incoherent wails. He missed the time he was able to hear clearly on both ears. He wanted to listen to music. Yeah, he would do that as soon as he'd get back into his room. Or right on the way to Heights Alliance, although it was just a walk for the duration of a single song. With some luck yeah, he'd do that. He wanted to hear birds chirping on both ears. It was annoying on only one ear, the other receiving the dulled version of everything. He wanted to hear all that sappy sheet like raindrops falling against the windows even though he hated it so much. He wanted to hear everything clean, without anything poking into his right ear. But he would never regret sacrificing his hearing, no. He had saved so many people, he had been a hero. He just felt like he was allowed to mourn it, goddamn. "Just don't bury it into yourself, aight?" Shitty Hair was done pushing things into his backpack and had staggered back to the blonde's desk. Katsuki was also done. He'd just been sitting in his chair staring holes into his zipped-up bag. Kirishima knew of Deku. Would it kill him if he were to actually tell him? Would it kill his pride? He didn't have a lot left of it when he was around the idiot, so what would he lose, right? "Come to my room later, got it?" Katsuki murmured, barely loud enough for his friend to catch, but he knew the guy did. He always did. Not waiting for the moron to scramble over to Katsuki because he would eventually, he moved a wired earbud into his functional ear. Mitsuki's "Goodbye, My Danish Sweetheart" started playing, and he sighed in content. Shitty Hair sneaked up next to him on his right, and grabbed himself the according wired earbud that hung down loosely. It was like a ritual. If they'd walk alone together back to the dorms or to school, the boys would share Katsuki's music, though that alone time was often ruined by the other extras. He knew the dumbass didn't always like what was crooning onto his eardrums, but for some odd reason he never bothered to say something about it. Or he grew to appreciate the soft hums too. Katsuki didn't ask and Kirishima didn't mention. Plumping down onto the tucked bed with a grunt, Shitty Hair caught the controller in its flight when Katsuki launched it at him like he was trying to knock his head off. "Don't throw them like that, man. What if I hadn't caught it? We'd have a window between our rooms now." He darted his arms to the wall he was leaning against. Katsuki didn't see it as a great problem. They were neighbors anyway. He liked the privacy of his own dorm though, so he didn't cherish the thought exactly. "I knew you'd catch it, Ehole, with or without your hands." The grumpy boy set up his switch, not eyeing Shitty Hair. He agreed silently and grabbed himself a pillow to put behind his back, waiting for Katsuki to finish the game up. Minecraft at its finest was two teenage boys sitting on a Tuesday evening on a bed, snacks like chips and peanut flips lined up between them and a soothing playlist warbling somewhere in the background, all while either mumbling to each other or yelling at the screen once a skeleton managed to mow one of the players down. Mostly, Katsuki was the one being shot, and Shitty Hair would cackle with the items dropping down, picking them up in the speed of God and everything that was holy, and activating his quirk because Katsuki would lunge at him. "If you don't give me back my pickaxe, I'll burn your base down, if and you hole." "Dude, you have efficiency 4. Like I don't know?" The redhead scooted away from him and closer to the wardrobe to prevent casualties. "Shitty Hair, I swear to give it back before I rip your teeth out one by one with my bare hands. No quirk, raw strength." He glared daggers into the laughing boy, who began curling up from all the demon laughing oh my any god. The empty chips bowl Katsuki hurled at Shitty Hair was an adequate reason for the pickaxe to be returned to its rightful owner in the end. So, what did you want to talk about? Hair for Brains pressed through gritted teeth while desperately trying not to get hit into a pretty fing tall cave by either a zombie, a creeper that was approaching him with all the peace in the world, or Katsuki. He didn't get an answer until the blonde accomplished his idea of transporting his friend down the giant cave, giggling maniacally while he was at it. He shoved a handful of peanut flips into his mouth before replying through his stuffed mouth. Deku ish that aleshoa, hanis home, bashtar, while re shalivid in over. Even though Shitty Hair barely understood a word, he heard the name Deku clear enough. You still gonna call him that, dude? Don't tell me you called him that when, hold up, when did you even see the guy? Wait, oh my god what? With each passing word, the redhead got more and more hi-fi, whirling the black controller around subconsciously. Oh right, when he'd returned back to the dorms on Saturday, he practically sprinted into his room and hadn't left it unless he'd felt especially hungry. In the evening, he despised curling up in a corner and mopping all over the place, but he hadn't the energy to stand up from his desk and do his late-night run around the school grounds. Or for anything at all. He just slumped over his math textbooks and busied himself with his trigonometry. Calm the hell down, asshat. I met him on Saturday in his beloved workshop he wouldn't crawl out of for the life of it, Katsuki mumbled. He wasn't necessarily keen on talking about it, but he wanted to be honest with his best friend. Not like he had been with someone else. Dude, calm down? You told me you bullied the poor guy incessantly throughout your childhood and decided a year ago you wanted to apologize if you'd ever see him again. Of course I won't be calm. The controller in the young hero's firm grasp seemed like it was struggling to stay intact. No need to remind me, moron, he got as a growled response. Yes, need, fired right back at him. Suddenly their game wasn't of interest for neither of them. I'm taking you didn't apologize. Did you at least keep yourself to call him that stupid name? Shitty Hair started once again. Katsuki faced him to glare into his displeased gaze. He kicked me out before I could even say bullshit. You told me he never stood up to you. Why would he tell you to leave him alone? He apparently grew a nice pair of balls. He didn't even call me that dumb nickname. The last part was more difficult for Katsuki to digest, which made no sense, because he was definitely upset over that or something unreasonable as that'd be stupid as f-. He'd simply been surprised. Dimmin, that had to hurt. He felt a shy blush of embarrassment creep up into his ear tips and he turned quickly away to plant his eyes on the screen, where their base was burning down due to a thunderstorm. How delightful. Hell no, it didn't. Whatever you say, princess. A pillow greeted his face before Shitty Hair could save himself. Better than a bowl, no? Anyway, he persisted on continuing the conversation, which set Katsuki quite a bit off. He regretted saying anything at all about the whole FING ordeal. Tell me, why is he the new Prince Charming? Why did you agree with the masses saying he's handsome? He curiously laid down on his stomach, feet dangling from the end of the bed and his chin placed on hands he propped up with his elbows. Like a child, really. FING moron. The blonde sensed one more blush settling further into his ear tips. Goddamn, how he hated those fleshy and so terrifyingly forthright motherfuckers. Bringing his scowl back to his excited friend, he paused the game. Everything was burning down and going to shit anyway, not much of a reason to halt it. It was more of a habit by now. I never said that, I said all of you dumbasses are seeing him like that. Alright, but what did he look like? There's gotta be a reason he's everyone's favorite gossip number one. Katsuki swallowed, you guessed it, nothing. He did not want to engage in this conversation any longer. Shitty Hair's persistence and Shitty Hair too. God FING, damn it. He buffed up since middle school, he spat out after contemplating whether he should mention it at all. So did we all. What's so special about that? No, you don't offend, you get it, Shitty Hair, he buffed up. Not even just physique, because that would be too boring. He FING shot up. Like what, 30 centimeters at least? Oh my god, okay, that's a lot. He grew out his ugly hair into an ugly wolf cut. He buffed up, he whispered the latter with widened eyes. as if he couldn't believe it himself. Okay, he buffed up a lot, he gained muscle, I got it, dude. You said he was pretty scrawny in middle school though? That's the whole point I'm trying to shove into you, dipshit. His tank top held together with hopes and dreams, F-. He dragged his palms over his face. It still stood surreal against the image he had of him from 2 years ago. You sure are focused on all that muscle part, huh? Hair for Brains joked. For the third time this late afternoon, a red shade fluttered up to his head, this time though his entire face bathed in a flushed tone of pure embarrassment and rage, and he began rasping every single insult he had ever learned of onto the giggling teenager on his bed. I'm not interested in his FNG build, motherfucker, Katsuki spluttered out as he held shitty hair up by his shirt collar, which was already outstretched by many other death grips. He'd heaved him off the bed and hauled him across the room before he grabbed onto his t-shirt collar. But you sure do emphasize it, the hanging boy chuckled to himself. Shitty hair probably felt like dying today, because what the F-. Avoiding a few internal injuries, he activated his hardening and let the punches rain down upon him. Dude, you're daily inside a changing room, full of buffed-up boys, and they never had you. Like that. The audacity. Kirishima. I just didn't FNG expect him to present himself like that, for FS sake. Don't think up weird shit like that. You're so effing disgusting, I'm going to dislocate your jaw if you ever say shit like that again. They settled back down on the bed, with Katsuki throwing more violent phrases at the other. I'm calling it's a ship. Do you want to die? Wait before that, I don't have my most important question answered. None of them are important, asswipe. What else did he say to you? Like, why the hell did he kick you out of the workshop? Didn't you say something about him sticking to you like glue? He FING hates me. I think. Oh. Silence, deafening silence draped over the two boys. Silence seemed to engulf him more often than not lately, and it kind of troubled him. Katsuki liked silence. It was peaceful, no one bothered his, but so it guaranteed tranquility, something he appreciated. But the quiet draping over him and his surroundings was rather awkward than his beloved calm. It wasn't until Shitty Hair spoke up again, but Katsuki preferred him keeping his mouth shut after what the boy dared to say. At least stop it with the nickname or something, I don't really think he cherishes that too badly, you know? Katsuki growled lowly as a reply and averted his glare onto the very interesting white controller laying in his lap. He hated how Hair for Brains was right. That stupid, old nickname Deku grew to be more of a habit than to consist for the sole purpose of picking on the called-out boy. And Katsuki didn't like acting out of his habits, not to mention out of the comfort zone of those habits. He'd feel exposed to the entire world and misunderstood and ridiculed. And the repentance shot right back into his gut, twisting into it, and into his heart, clenching it painfully. Because why did he have the right to decide whether he wanted to find himself exposed and ridiculed when he caused those exact feelings onto someone else? His ego and pride sometimes amazed him the most from everyone else. You should apologize, Bakugo. You wanted to do that, you planned on doing that in case you'd ever see him again. You said you swore it, if it's gonna be the last effing thing I'll ever do. The great Katsuki Bakugo doesn't go back on his word, does he? The great Katsuki Bakugo whipped his head in exasperation toward his friend. No, that a-hole does if he never go back on his word. Good to know. Now go apologize, the redhead demanded. With a firm tone. Who was he to order the great Katsuki Bakugo around? Sure, his best friend and probably the closest person to him right now, but who was he to do such iniquity? F off, I have things to do. He spat as he returned his scowl to rest on his incredibly dazing white controller and crossed his arms over his chest. Like what? Saving our base from burning down? Shitty Hair nodded at the screen. More like reviving it back from its fuckus ashes. Right? Katsuki heard cackling for the presumably 100th time at his side. Once more on the mildly warm Tuesday evening slowly turning towards darker hours, Kirishima hung in the air, held up by his abused shirt collar and accepting the storm of fists raining down on him, failing to break numerous bones with a serene smile etched into his face. Division times, star operator division times. He was tired. He'd drained all the energy off of his body with the rescue training which had been inessentially difficult. Why would you willingly latch yourself onto a goddamn rupturing building? Burning from the inside with multiple gas tanks sitting right next to you? Even though it had been simulation like usual and nothing and no one, sadly, would combust or die, there'd been no need to make the dummy additionally venture deeper into the FING ruins. Whatever. After wasting all his strength on that bullshit, he'd crammed the rest of his Friday like crazy in his room, letting the remaining sparks of energy drip into his notebooks in form of inked handwriting. Not like he really required it, he was very well enlightened about everything happening in his classes. He just needed to get his mind off of the thoughts plaguing him for effing once. All in all, his Friday was as uneventful as ever and decidedly enervating. Nothing new. What was new, though, was the force of penitence lingering in his chest, clinging onto his heart and clutching at its stitches as though it wanted to rip the threads out. If he drove too far into the emotion, he would encounter memories he was not prepared for just yet. Maybe he'd never be, he wasn't sure whether he was fine with that. He certainly didn't want to busy himself with them, but he imagined avoiding it entirely could present itself as unnecessarily convoluted. And since it would have been far too simple and easy, Katsuki didn't favor it easy, not at all. If that was it already, it wasn't. He asked himself where the hell the exasperated abhorrence came from the moment Deku stepped foot in front of him. Rather towered over him with a woeful glare, but whatever. There was the theory of experiencing emotions over a person which you haven't seen in a long time, that you assumed you had resolved, but felt them again after seeing them. It had to be this. Nothing else made sense to him. For FS sake, he just wanted to FING sleep like a normal human being without waking up in the middle of the night and nearly vomiting all over his bedsheets thanks to the disgust directed at no other than himself. Katsuki ripped his hearing out a tad bit too violently and threw it as carefully as he allowed it to fly onto his mahogany desk. He rolled back on his left side and faced his soft peachy painted wall. Well, rather dark blue, considering it was 2:48 a.m. What FNG ever? His constantly rotating doubts morphing into anxieties, and then the typical anxiety stomachache dragged him from his bed to his compact bathroom where he spent a prolonged amount of time on the toilet seat. He felt the remorse boring into his entire being as he wandered between his bed and the bathroom. His stupid brain shouldn't be displaying wrath against Deku, Katsuki decided. Even if the emotion was old, it didn't FANG belong there. Moreover, he swore to himself he'd solved any pent-up feelings already. Nothing should have been left of the hideous part of his brain. The hatred should have been motherfucking gone. Misinterpreted hatred. He'd discover a while ago it was all just pathetic envy and confusion over the younger's martyr complex. He still saw it as odd, but taught himself to just accept it and get it on with. Deku would just launch his, formerly, tiny and incredibly useless body in front of anyone in order to protect them, even if it literally would provide him his demise. The lacking self-preservation and selflessness scared him, irritated him and frustrated him to the extent of Katsuki bullying his childhood friend just to get the poor boy off of him. And yet, Deku wouldn't leave his side, as though he was sticking to Katsuki like superglue. It had disgusted the volatile teenager back then, and he'd stepped his own game up. Katsuki had told Deku to kill himself. Even his lackey'd been reluctant to agree, and Deku stopped even trying to talk to him from that point on. He'd had no way of knowing what he did to the green-haired boy, but he hadn't cared enough to give it a good demon thought. Now see where that got him? He hadn't been able to understand why Deku, a quirkless wooden doll, would choose to save others over getting his own but somewhere safe. He'd had to get the hell away from him as far as possible at that, but Deku would just follow him like a DM loyal puppy that had nowhere else to go beside a brat like him, a bully. Like he'd been looking down on him, as if he'd been better than him and stuck to him to prove the contrast to everyone and their grandma and maybe their fish while he'd been at it. Katsuki believed it as very plausible. When he'd slipped and plunged down from the fallen tree trunk serving as messy bridge over a slim river, it had looked more like stream. The sun been prominent that summer and had caused the flow of water to evaporate into a lean gush. Deku sprinted right after him and held out his tubby little fingers. Katsuki'd stared at the tiny hand like he'd been handed a batch of fresh uranium. The outstretched palm was the last straw. and he decided to bully the shit out of the boy then and there. Slapping the helping hand away like a fly buzzing around him, Katsuki liked using that as comparison when the topic was brought up every time. He'd always shoved the vestige of guilt down if it would ebb up occasionally, and he'd tell himself it had just been the old hag's bad culinary skills. It wasn't. Ifang learned cooking from her. Until the guilt was too much, too great of a blooming emotion to be ignored and swallowed down repeatedly. Yeah, his first year of high school sure had been something. But he had to admit, in all earnestness and the mortifyingly embarrassing honesty, Shitty Hair had done a frighteningly good job at carving the repentance out of his core as diligently as he'd done. Without the annoying moron, he would have never even dared approaching the memories. So yeah, he was really FING tired. His temporal lobe excelled at plaguing him with the worst of bad memories, though he deserved that at least. He wanted to atone, seek forgiveness and redemption. He'd reached that verdict a long time ago. Katsuki saw it as adequate thinking to act upon it. He'd pay the workshop the delight of his wretched visage, for the sole purpose of spilling his emotions into his old childhood friend. And get his goddamn gauntlets glanced at, because through all the emotional turmoil, he forgot about the misfortunes once more. By the end of today's hero class, his sweat absorbers refused to be efficacious and his gloves barely allowed any droplets of salty sweat of a successful escape. For the life of it, he couldn't figure out what the DMN problem was. He looked into and dismembered his gauntlets as much as his schedule permitted him. Whether they were clogged or just FANG broken, his ultimates were hindered thanks to the koi playing gear. God FING damn it. He attempted the tempting idea of sleeping, but as soon as he closed his eyelids, the scenery of the old river came back up, rewinding to its heart's content since Katsuki was too FNG exhausted to do bullshit about it. After a week of not seeing Deku, why not relive the oh-so-pleasant awkwardness between the hallway and the development studio and the icy scowl sprawled over the now really FNG tall boy's freckled face? What a FNG blast he was about to have. Closing his eyes, he let his inner eye replay all the formerly glorified reminiscences of his deeds from his childhood, too exhausted to actually give two flying F's and to try averting the remorse. He didn't have anything left in his bowels that could complain about the bullshit either. Katsuki sunk into a dreamless sleep that barely contributed to ameliorate his lassitude. Rushing for the second Saturday in row down the staircase, he grumbled upon not finding his DMN cereal anywhere the moment he scavenged for it. Those shitty crumbs were under the few breakfast ideas he'd accepted and lived with for all the 18 years of his life. And one of the idiots he called friends probably felt especially suicidal today since he couldn't find that sheet FANG anywhere he searched for. Not in the lowest drawers, not in the cabinets, not hidden somewhere on the kitchen counter. He swore to himself whoever ate the last few bits was going to have the next cereal shoved up their butt. He deemed a granola bar as worthy substitute and pushed one exemplar from their respective drawer, moving it into one of the voids of his sweatpants pockets. Just as Katsuki believed he'd escaped successfully without any extra bothering his butt, he set one black sneaker on the front porch. What would the world be if Katsuki FANG Bakugo wouldn't be bothered? One filled with a too large amount of tranquility, apparently. He sensed an unyielding clutch a split second too late and was spun around by his right forearm more violently than he'd appreciate and honestly expect, until he dug the heel of one of his old sneakers into the wooden floor, coming to a halt. He hated how he could run around without any expectations and he'd still be smarter than with them, because how on God's sweet green earth would he have guessed if and half chose to embrace his demise with open arms today? Katsuki glared into his classmates' mismatched eyes before mustering something close to a sentence. What the hell are you in? Katsuki was denied the permission of hauling actual insults at the BED as he was thrown off guard once more by the fierce glower his own crimson scowl was met with. What the hell were you doing in front of the workshop last week? Icy Hot hissed his part of the dialogue. In a hushed tone in order to not catch any unwelcome attention, which would be effing plighted as soon as Katsuki would take a breath to scream his overly intelligent slurs. Though at the moment he was busy trying to fathom what just motherfucking happened. That fuckface hadn't snarled even in his direction after he got a grip on himself and finally accepted his left side or whatever. He had supposed the asswipe was done with beaching at everyone if required, but to him it seemed Katsuki was the only exception to deserve being lashed out upon. Nonetheless, the ash blonde was rarely ever, never to be precise, the victim of a verbal assault like that, or even barked at by people of the same DMN age. He only let his teachers chew up out, and even then the number of adults was a steady low. Katsuki saw it as a little challenging to try and chug any insults right now, or try to form a coherent phrase to reply with. But he liked challenges, so he took on the opportunity to engage in one. Getting my hearing aid? His hesitant response sounded more like a question than he intended, but at least it was a response instead of something between a growl and an unfavorable yelp. He wasn't often speechless. It's been months, probably, since he didn't need to desperately sweat over a string of thought to hang on to. He'd always have at least the next best swear word sitting idly on his tongue waiting to be freed to whoever had enough ball to piss his Katsuki off. He was catapulted back into an adequate thinking process when Icy Hot shot the next load of hushed words at him. I know that. I meant what you were trying to say to is Midoriya. Okay, alright. Fact aside that the entirety of Class 3A knew of his little hearing loss bullshit and that it drove him up FING Wall's first name basis? First names and Shoto Todoroki? An event in this universe, this galaxy, this timeline? Katsuki tried to swallow down a fair amount of spit resting under his tongue and ignore the already very familiar twists and twirls of the invisible and yet so stark dagger dancing across and inside of his chest. Since he hadn't eaten anything yet, he had the pleasure of his intestines shutting up for once. He knew DMN well that this shit didn't call anyone else by their first name. None of his classmates had achieved that intimacy with him. But Deku had. That little what? Katsuki was convinced that loosely degree of formality had been swept over to the heterochromic moron at some point from either Deku or the pink-haired maniac, though he was sure it originated from the girl Deku used to care about. That kind of sheet. Maybe he doesn't anymore. Who even knew at this point? Well, obviously half and half, but Katsuki wasn't about to yell that into the scarred grimace in front of his own tensed-up facial features. It would look like the great Katsuki FANG Bakugo actually gave a rat's butt about the shitty nerd. He didn't. Or well, maybe he did, but only due to the sake of the remorse bubbling up. He didn't want to rebuild their long-forgotten friendship after all of those years. He missed it, but he certainly didn't think of himself as deserving of a friendship with the younger. Whatever. Just hearing the insatiable BSRD caused him to long for the stupid nickname he was given ages ago by the green-haired loser. Bakugo wasn't something he wanted to listen to. His surname would have been sufficient. It would sound odd, but it would be sufficient. It would hurt, but it would be sufficient. Bakugo was not sufficient. And it piled up acid in his throat of how badly he didn't want to admit that to himself. Even if he did, he wasn't allowed to have it. He didn't deserve it. And he shouldn't be allowed to yearn for the sound of his nickname oozing out of the vocals of his childhood friend.